Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review. The book that we're going to be looking at this time is The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle. It came out in 2021, authored by Myisha, and I will actually say that this is a book that I use in my classes with students. I have them read some excerpts of it, so I think you can tell right off the bat that my opinion of it is probably going to be rather favorable. What are Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews? So this is a series that focuses on philosophy in a very broad sense, typically looking at fairly recently published work. So this one is 4 years old, but it's still incredibly relevant today. And so we look at matters of philosophy as such, how it applies to ordinary life, ethics, leadership, psychology, the emotions, personal development. And so actually this one ticks a number of those boxes. And it's honest book reviews in the sense that I'm going to give you my take, whether it's saying it's a good book or a bad book or anything in between, without giving you any fluff. Right? You can trust the recommendations that I'm giving you. So let's launch right into the review of The Case for Rage. We always like to begin with the three big S's, talking about the style, the structure, and kind of a summary of the book. And I'm going to begin with a mini summary at sort of the very highest level. This is actually coming from the introduction to the work. And, what is the main argument of this book? That a certain kind of anger, which Cherry is calling Lordian rage after Audre Lorde's, particularly her essay, The Uses of Anger, that Lordian rage, as she says, has an important role to play in anti-racist struggle. Taking its name from Audre Lorde, the black feminist poet and scholar who first articulated the version of rage I'll be exploring, Lordian rage is targeted at racism. It tends towards metabolization and aims for change. It is informed by an inclusive and liberating perspective. And so she says, although Lordian rage may not be necessary, it can be uniquely used for anti-racist purposes. So I think that's actually a great summary of the overall point of the work itself. Now, it is written, as she's going to tell us, not specifically for an academic audience. It's actually written for a much broader, let's say, spectrum of people. So she tells us, I write this book as a moral psychologist and philosopher of race. I would say also as an important ethicist. This means I'm concerned with the nature of anger, its functionality, and its cultivation in the context of racial oppression. And she says, while I engage the work of historical figures and use social movements as examples, this is not an intellectual historical project. It's also not my aim to describe how anger is operated within certain social movements, but it is supposed to be a short crossover book that appeals to the academic and activist, the philosopher, and the citizen. My aim is to be philosophically grounded and accessible. So, philosophically grounded, she actually knows what she's talking about. That's true. Accessible, written for a more general audience. I would say that's also happening in this book as well. It's very well written and just the right amount, I would say, of material at different points. It's got 7 chapters to the work, as well as pretty extensive notes, bibliography, and a well-done index. So, there's a short preface, there's an introduction, and then there's 7 main chapters titled Painting in Broad Strokes, which we'll talk about in a moment, Fitting Fury, Rightful Rage. Chapter 3 is Rage in Work Clothes. Chapter 4, Breaking Racial Rules Through Rage. Chapter 5, Rage Renegades, a special message to, in quotes, allies. Chapter 6, Anger Management and Alternative View. And then the very, very short Chapter 7, The End of Rage, in which we get some really interesting background on why she is writing the book and how she's writing the book in the first place. So I would say that a good portion of this book is really providing what we would call an extended argument with a lot of supporting lines of argumentation and evidence for the contention that anger understood in a certain way, Lordian rage, can actually be quite useful, very helpful for anti-racist struggle, and which is something that she's saying we should be engaged in. I think she's right about that. So there's a lot of, we could say, side arguments and distinctions that will be made along the way, as well as some recommendations. For example, in the Chapter 5 about allyship and Chapter 6 about anger management. So there's a lot of tools being provided to people. I would like to mention this point of view of the work itself. So this is actually coming from Chapter 7, and she talks about, Lord herself having some things in common with her, or, the opposite. So she says that, in 1973, a 10-year-old black boy, Clifford Glover, was shot and killed by a white New York City police officer. He was indicted for his murder and then acquitted of charges. Audre Lorde heard the verdict on the radio while driving from the airport. Sickened with fury, blinded by rage, writes her biographer, she pulled her car over. And she's, thinking through it, and some stuff came out of it. And Cherry is going to say the book that you have in your hands was written on the proverbial side of the road. Why? I wrote it and revised it upon hearing about the raw gunshot wounds that pierced the black skin of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and others whose killers were never indicted or when indicted were acquitted. Right? So she goes on with a lot of other examples. She also mentions having some other things in common with Lorde. Lorde was the darkest child in her family. I am too. She constantly felt out of place. I often also do. She minored in philosophy in college. I majored in it. She was a queer black woman. I am as well. We taught at the same university and unapologetically wore our natural hair way before it became trendy in our respective eras. And so, this is quite interesting background stuff. And, we get more discussion of what the work is about in the introduction, remembering being angry and being angry at racism. So, that is part of what's situating this book. Is it just, something that people of color should have to read? No, this is actually a really great examination of one particular kind of anger put against the backdrop of a lot of other understandings of anger within a particular context in American social, dynamics, history that has to do with racism. But it's got some broader implications, as we'll talk about. So I think we've covered the 3 S's sufficiently. Now let's talk about some of the key points of the work. So there is a lot going on within the relatively short work. The entirety of the chapters gives us 170 pages, and it's really, quite dense, we could say, but not in a way that would be off-putting. So one of the key ideas from the start is that this is about Lordian rage at American racist dynamics and how, one ought to respond to those. But it has implications for all sorts of other cases where some people have been, oppressed, discriminated against, exploited in terms of, other types of distinctions. So I think that the lessons about anger here could be quite useful in a number of other places. So she talks, for example, about feminist literature, and she says, although a person could read the feminist literature then to decide to apply those insights into their own racial projects, I think speaking explicitly to the specificity of people's lives and struggles is important. Just as oppressions have similarities, there are also dissimilarities, right? So thinking about what anger distinctly does in the context of racial injustice is a way of being attuned to those differences, and at the same time seeing them as, important distinction here, illuminating rather than divisive. And she's going to go on and say, anger plays the role of expressing the value of people of color and of racial justice. It provides eagerness, optimism, and self-belief needed to fight against persistent and powerful racist people and systems. And it allows the outrage to break certain racial rules as a form of intrinsic and extrinsic violence. And so that's sort of a blueprint for where the work is going. She is going to begin in this first chapter, painting in broad strokes, by saying that very often when people are thinking about anger, they are painting in broad strokes. They're not approaching it with a lot of distinctions or nuance. And, she talks about certain philosophical or religious points of view, for example, that of Stoicism and Seneca. Seneca has an entire book on anger that she engages quite a bit, where anger is always bad. It's never serving any good purpose. And she brings up, the Buddhist sage Santideva, and Buddhism to a lesser extent in other places, talking about anger not being constructive as well. And she wants to argue that it actually could be useful. So what has to happen? You need a more complex viewpoint on anger. And she says that not every person who's written about anger has painted it broadly. A few philosophers have attempted to describe anger's varieties, although this is not a common philosophical move, and she calls them variation artists. So this is one of the very first distinctions that she's going to make. Philosophers are great at making distinctions. It's one of our little powers, you could say, that we bring to the table. She is doing a lot of that in this work. She talks about concern distinction, where people classify types of anger by what the anger is about or what concerns it manifests. So it could be good or bad depending on that. Then there's intent distinction. Anger is good or bad depending on its wish or desire. And then there's type distinction that view anger as, like it could be good anger over here because of the type, bad anger over here. She brings up Joseph Butler, who's one of the, modern theorists of anger, who distinguishes between sudden anger and deliberative anger that appears to fall into that. And she says that Aristotle himself appears to fall in this in terms of moderate anger is good, excessive anger is bad, right? The so-called golden mean, which turns out to be a lot more complicated than just being in the middle. So that's one important set of distinctions. She also says that we can look, and this is under some preliminary points, on the target, action tendency, and aim of the anger, as well as the perspective that informs the anger. Okay, so that's another important set of distinctions. She is also then going to talk about 5 varieties of what she's calling rage. And 4 of these are usually going to be bad. as a matter of fact, they're all deficient in one way or another. One of them is often quite helpful. So rogue rage is, a type of anger at injustice, but it's sort of going against anybody. It's rather indiscriminate. Wipe rage is another one that she talks about. She uses as a paradigm for this. The marchers in 2017 protesting the removal of a Confederate statue. The targets are not anyone and everyone. They are racial others, right? And then there's ressentiment rage aimed at a racial group in power, expressed by those who are without power. Narcissistic rage, where one, she's taking this from Bell Hooks. Narcissistic rage is directed against those who target me. So you're only really upset about racism when you're the object. And then finally, Lordian rage, which she says contrasts with the other types of rage in stark ways. And she's going to, talk her way through this and also distinguish it against Martha Nussbaum's transition anger. Lordian rage is aimed at change. It's not going the same directions as these others. She's going to bring up a number of other important ways of distinguishing anger. So there's a discussion here of fittingness versus appropriateness, and giving some ways to distinguish these from each other. She's also going to talk about some of the challenges that somebody who is following Lordian rage can run into. For example, there's a long discussion of this. There are 3 obstacles. White ignorance, there she's taking that from Charles Mill, which is an active unwillingness to know or willingness to ignore the facts about our racial reality. White skepticism, which says, are you really sure that it was racism? And then finally, white empathy, which winds up being empathy not for the victims of racism, but for those who are engaging in them. And so, Lordian rage is going to be impacted by this because people see the Lordian rage and they're like, no, you're just angry. So that's an important point that she's making there. She's going to talk about the issue of intensity. How much should we be angry? How should the expression of it look like? And she says we could, one option is to put it through a kind of Goldilocks test, sort of, an Aristotelian point of view. And she looks at, a lot of different situations, including discussing microaggressions. There's a discussion here of a certain kind of threshold effect, and the fact that oftentimes intensity is to some degree out of our control once we do get angry. She's going to discuss then what it is that Lordian rage is doing. So one important function of it, she says, is that Lordian rage not only registers racial injustice, it recognizes and advertises justice's worth. So it is not just oppositional, you could say, it is also affirmative of the basis for that opposing. As she says, a person can recognize injustice without experiencing anger, but anger is also a way of, at least certain types of anger, grasping that injustice is happening and that things should, in fact, be different. And then she talks about, Lordian rage as, here's the subchapter title, pointing out disvalue, pointing to value. So there's a broader sense in which it's not just justice, but the value of people, And so this is quite important, I would say. Then she's going to go on, and she's got an interesting discussion of Aristotle and Joseph Butler. So she's engaging with some, we could call them classical sources on anger and justice, forgiveness, all of these related issues. And she, is going to compare and contrast Lordian rage with that. And then she talks about another important function of Lordian rage. What does it actually do? So Lord said that anger could be fuel. How does it work that way? She talks about eagerness and being willing to engage in things, optimism and self-belief. When you get angry in the right way, it affirms you and the people that you're connected with as a person. So, all of this is helpful for, as in the next section, fueling freedom fighters, helping people to stand up against racism, whether individual or structural, and to, as the slogan goes, tell truth to power, right? She also notes that this is not some sort of sweeping, okay, get as angry as you want so long as it's Lordian. She points out this is going to come with some challenges, some potential obstacles as well. It could deter potential allies. That's, an issue. And then she says, is it right to say Lordian rage is counterproductive in that it alienates political allies? And she says, no, the problem is actually not with the Lordian rage. It's actually with the ally who's going to gatekeep your, being able to be angry or not. Maybe they're not really an ally, even though they would like to think of themselves that way. And the next, discussions are of some other issues that I could bring up, deterring the powerful, right? You can make the powerful defensive. And so it could deter the powerful from hearing their claims and thus be counterproductive. And, she notes quite rightly that, again, the people in power, if they're actually not going to listen to you because you are rightly angry and express that, they weren't going to listen to you in the first place. So, and actually there may be some cases where they do, in fact, listen to you because you're angry, at least for a little while. It opens up a space. And here she talks about the recommendations, including by Martha Nussbaum, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, that, anger, it maybe could get a hearing, but wouldn't it be better to replace it with love or forgiveness? And she talks about a love myth that quite a few people have put out there. The myth consists of the assumptions that love can do no wrong, love is incompatible with blameworthy emotions, and love is all we need in the pursuit of racial justice. And she unpacks these, looking at Martin Luther King, who didn't say, get rid of all of your anger altogether. She brings up the fact that King wrote Letter from a Birmingham Jail while he was angry about things. And so, anger could actually be quite on point in these sorts of cases. Going on, she is going to talk about breaking racial rules through rage. Now, this is a rather focused chapter. So racial rules are the sort of unspoken background rules that structure our society insofar as it remains racist. She identifies two of these and explores them in detail. Racial rule number one, remember whiteness and keep it holy. So Lordian rage is going to break this rule and will help people to perhaps get out of applying that rule to themselves. Rule 2, thou shalt not have a right to white male anger. Who do we allow to be angry in our society? And we don't have to necessarily focus just on race, although the book does. We could think about any sort of one person having, a privileged position or power over another. You could think of things as simple as the petulant patron at the diner or the coffee shop gets to be a rageaholic and the manager smooths things over while the employee has to suck it up, right? So there's a lot of things like this. And in a society that does remain still racist in many ways, white males, at least certain kinds of white males, are often given a pass, whereas everybody else getting angry, that means that they're dangerous. That means that they're uppity. That means that they're not grateful, or pick whatever else you want, right? So Lordy and Rage goes against that. And, she brings up a number of important examples of people who could be kind of representatives, Serena Williams, Anita Hill, who wound up being targeted as, going too far. And then she's got a really interesting discussion here of not just Barack Obama, but the Key and Peele show that has sketches where Barack Obama had a anger interpreter, and how Barack Obama actually incorporated this into the White House Correspondents' Dinner and kind of subverted the sketch, allowing himself to show anger over climate change, with the anger interpreter being like, oh man, what's going on? So very, very interesting observations there. There's a chapter called Rage Renegades, a special message to allies. And, she's looking at people who view themselves, and in many cases actually are, in solidarity with the oppressed, people who view themselves as allies. And she says they will also have this anti-racist anger, particularly if they value all members of a society, judge that racial injustice is wrong, do not consider themselves free until all people are free, and aim to resist racist systems. And she calls these rage renegades, right? So it's quite possible for someone to be a genuine ally. And then she's going to point out some of the problems that arise when people try to do that, but don't quite go far enough. So she has a section here called Same Feelings Does Not Equal Same Experience. You can indeed have similar feelings about, racism, particular cases, without assuming that your experiences somehow correspond to each other and that you should talk about how you're experiencing the same thing, which will be rather unjust. White anger mattering more. Allies should not, place themselves front and center in their anger in ways that take away from people who are more targeted by it. And she's, got some very interesting discussions of that. One example would be, using social media and talking so much about, your own anger and ignoring that of others. Grandstanding, moral anger, grandstanding. She talks about wanting to be perceived as especially moral and anti-racist, and using their rage as evidence often ends up being harmful. And then white saviorism, right? The idea that what's really needed here is an ally to step in and take over, which is, again, not very productive. And a lot of these stem from sort of unquestioned, unconscious assumptions that people have that they haven't really seen through. She's got another section on anger management, where she talks about how anger management has been typically looked at both in ancient philosophy and in modern psychology, using a number of different reference points. And then she says that, this might not actually be that useful when it comes to Lordy and Rage. And instead, she proposes what she calls an alternative plan, which consists of 4 techniques and focuses specifically on Lordian rage, not anger in general. And these 4 different techniques, one is called the expression technique, actually expressing anger without necessarily getting violent, but finding means to do that, right? Rather than stuffing it down, pretending that it's not there. That can be a very important way of showing that, you're going to deal with the Lordian rage. Another she calls the solidarity technique, getting connected with others who can provide mutual support and community. Very important. Finding out that other people are angry, communicating with them that you're also angry. A goals and plan technique. Lordian rage is about change. So figuring out what you can actually try to do, not necessarily succeed in doing, but actually trying to do. And she brings up, Lord asserting that anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. Anger translated into action. This is Cherry, that is used to do work, right? So that can also be quite helpful. And then she talks about a resistance technique. And the resistance technique, very interesting here. She says the first step is to squelch the anger police, right? Don't listen to the people who want to tell you that you only get to be this angry, your anger is inappropriate, and you resist them. And she actually suggests that, when you're dealing with anger police or anger dismissers, what to do is not to directly argue against their criticism, but rather block their criticism by rejecting some of their premises. And, so for example, when somebody says, oh, you're so bitter, you say, what's wrong with bitterness? So you place the burden on the others, which is a very smart rhetorical technique. The last chapter, the end of Rage, is going to be, laying out why she wanted to write this and why it's particularly relevant. And she gives you kind of a recap of the role of anger in anti-racist struggle and what you can do. So it's a very well put together book, I would say. That gives you some of the key ideas that you're going to find in it. What are the good points of this work? Well, again, I think it's very well written. It's very timely. It's a great analysis. It's putting forth, I would say, some real contributions in thinking about anger that are connected with the traditional ways of looking at it and reinterpreting them and bringing it into connection with Audre Lorde's thought in ways that are applicable today. And I think a really important feature of this book, particularly since Martha Nussbaum, who takes up an awful lot of space in contemporary philosophy of emotion, whether she deserves to or not, that's a separate question. She actually does take up a lot of space, came out with her own book before this, Anger and Forgiveness, where she's arguing against the sort of stuff that Cherry's advocating here. I think that a critique of Nussbaum, as Cherry is providing, is pretty important, right? So, here's just one little bit. Note that Lordian rage is transformative anger and not transition anger. For Martha Nussbaum in particular, revolutionary justice can only occur after anger transitions to generosity and love. Lordian rage, on the other hand, doesn't need to disappear or transition to something else in order to achieve certain results, right? So, in a way, she's saying, Nussbaum, you're hamstringing people who you should actually be helping out. There's another great discussion of how Nussbaum got King wrong here. And she says, in her 2018 essay, From Anger to Love, Self-Purification and Political Resistance, Nussbaum seeks to provide a detailed account of King's views on anger. She admits King doesn't explicitly say much about anger, but what he does say gives us clues about his overall views. And then she says, well, I agree. Using the same strategy, I'm going to focus on King's stuff, and I believe they support my account of Lordian rage in general and in the relationship between Lordian rage and positive action in particular. And I'll tell you this, as somebody who's actually read a lot of King and taught him in class, and having read and taught Nussbaum and having read and taught this book, Cherry's right, Nussbaum is wrong. So I think that's a really important point. I think I really like how she treats anger as something complex. There's a lot of important distinctions that we can make. I think those 5 classifications that she has of different kinds of rage, very, very helpful. That's something I actually have my own students engage with. She's got a number of good engagements with the, philosophical and psychological literature, as well as a number of, I think, useful references to current events, popular culture, that make for a very strong composition. It's very well thought through. There is a central argument that I would say by the 4th chapter has been well established, and then it turns into kind of problem solving and additional distinctions. And, I think that this unpacking, reinterpreting Lordian rage, that is the absolute strength of this book. So, when I teach classes on anger, we actually begin with Lord's The Uses of Anger, and students encounter it and read it, and they're like, this is very powerful stuff. So an extended philosophical examination and defense of Lordian rage, very strong point to this book. Is there anything I find problematic about the work? I would say that the stuff that I have to say is only at the level of quibbles. There's nothing in it where I'm like, oh, she got that wrong, and here's the receipts for that. It's more a matter of emphasis, and I think that perhaps it's a reflection of writing for a popular audience. There is a little bit of a gap in thinking about, for example, ancient philosophy on anger. Lots of discussion of Seneca, of Aristotle, but it's interesting. There's like no engagement with Plato or the Platonist tradition, which includes Plutarch, who has an entire work on controlling anger. There's also discussion of Galen, I should point out, too, on the strong side. But, I think maybe, she says, listen, I'm not trying to do an intellectual history here. I'm not trying to do a survey of all the different sources. But it does lead to saying a few things where maybe it's a little bit too strongly worded and not technically correct, but it doesn't take away from the overall argument. So, she says, for example, that the techniques of ancient thinkers and contemporary psychologists apply more to proportionality and less to the appropriate motivational, productive, and resistant features of Lordian rage. And, of course, they didn't talk about Lordian rage. It wasn't coined back then. But I do think that some ancient thinkers and some psychologists do address those features. I would say that the claim that most ancient thinkers argue for anger elimination and their anger control techniques are specific to that goal. Again, that's not really right. The Platonist, the Aristotelian, the Epicurean traditions, as opposed to the Stoic, don't do that. And if we're looking at early Christian thought, that's an engagement with those, like Augustine or John, Chrysostom or Lactantius. They don't aim at elimination of anger. That would be sort of an extreme position. So, technically not correct, but doesn't really matter that much. Another area like that is when she invokes, as she did in her earlier work, the 3 loves that the Greeks recognized. And, one of them is philia, one of them is eros, the other is agape. Well, it was never that simple in ancient Greece. Now, she's getting that from Martin Luther King, who does actually say that in his work. So I think that's quite forgivable. And that's all that I have to say as far as criticism of the work. So these are pretty small quibbles rather than damning, charges or criticisms. So maybe you could throw them out altogether if you don't consider them that important. All right, my final thoughts on this book. It is great. I unreservedly recommend it. I think that everybody who's interested in anger or who's interested in issues of race and justice in America should read it, including people who would, dismiss it and say, well, I don't think America's a racist society. This is too woke or anything like that. Those are exactly the people who won't want to read it, but really should read it. And I think the way that Cherry writes, she might actually get a hearing from some of those people. Anybody who actually is committed to, egalitarianism, thinking that we should treat people like human beings, regardless of race, gender, all these other sort of qualities, and that we should, treat people well. This is an important book. You should get it. You should read it. I think that I'll put it to you this way. You may have heard me say this in other reviews. It's the kind of book that inspires emulation, where you're like, man, I wish I could have written a book this good. So that'll be my last word on it. I think it's a great work and that you should get your hands on a copy.